There is a geologist's field report assembled in the summer of 1874 that has never received the attention its subject demands. It was produced by Newton Horace Winchell, the Minnesota state geologist, who traveled with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's military expedition into the western Dakota Territory, under orders describing the expedition as a scientific survey. Winchell's assignment was to document the mineral wealth of a territory known to the Dakota Sioux as Pahasapa, the hills that are black, a region formally guaranteed to the Lakota people by the Fort Laramie Treaty, signed only 6 years before that summer, in 1868. His findings covered limestone formations, sedimentary layers running deep below the visible surface, signs of cave systems extending further than the expedition could follow, and mineral deposits of considerable complexity. And then the gold was found. Custer's dispatches from the expedition described gold traces in the gulches and the streambeds, and the country heard what it had been waiting to hear. Winchell's geological record, with its careful notation of cave formations and subsurface complexity below the granite ridgelines, became a secondary document in a story that had already been decided before the column returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln. The scientific survey that had provided official justification for entering treaty land was absorbed into a political outcome that no survey had been designed to produce. What neither Winchell's report nor Custer's dispatches addressed was what the Lakota already knew was buried beneath those hills. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. For the Lakota, Pahasapa was not a landform defined by its mineral content. The hills were understood as the center of the world, and that understanding was geographically specific in ways that most outside observers who first encountered it either misread as metaphor or dismissed as ornamentation. The Black Hills stood at the heart of Dakota Territory, and the obligations the hills carried were bound to the land itself. Ceremonies were conducted in the high places. The dead were returned to the earth there, and the knowledge that required proximity to specific formations within the hills was sought there by those whose responsibility was to hold it. The relationship between the people and the hills was not incidental to Lakota life. It organized Lakota life, determined where people moved through the seasons, and shaped what obligations were carried from one generation to the next. The oral record that preserved this relationship is old, older than the Fort Laramie Treaty, older than the first European cartographic accounts of the northern plains. It was maintained through the ceremonial and social structures of Lakota life, transmitted by elders whose responsibility was to hold knowledge accurately and pass it on without distortion. That transmission did not require paper. It required continuity, and the Lakota had maintained the continuity of this knowledge across more generations than any American institution had been in existence. Among the oldest traditions connected to the Black Hills is the account of a cave the Lakota called Washu. The name translates approximately as the breathing place of the earth. The cave sits within the limestone formations of the southern Black Hills, and its defining characteristic is one that any person standing at its entrance can verify directly. Air moves through the opening with measurable force, drawn in or pushed out by pressure differentials generated within the cave system below. The earth at this location does, in a literal and physically observable sense, breathe. The Lakota had noticed this and built an understanding around it that they maintained across centuries. The Oglala Lakota understood Washu to be a site of emergence. According to the oral traditions preserved by Oglala elders, the first buffalo came from the world beneath the earth at this place, and the first Lakota followed them into the present world. The cave marked an origin point. In the Lakota account, this was where the people and the buffalo had entered the present world, coming up from below into a surface they had never yet inhabited. The world beneath the Black Hills held, in that account, the original world, the one that preceded the present age, and the emergence tradition, preserved at Washu, described the moment when the present world received its first inhabitants. The anthropological accounts that documented Lakota oral testimony from the 1870s through the turn of the 20th century preserve specific descriptions of what Washu represented within the knowledge system the Lakota maintained. In accounts recorded by ethnographers working in the region, the cave was described as the site from which the white buffalo calf woman had entered and exited the world, the same figure who had brought the sacred pipe to the Lakota people. The connection between the cave and the pipe ceremony was not a minor one. The pipe ceremony organized the most fundamental obligations the Lakota maintained toward one another and toward the land. The cave was the place from which that knowledge was understood to have entered the present world. This account was not assembled after the fact to support a territorial claim. It was being transmitted across generations before any American military expedition crossed the Missouri River. Ethnographers who recorded Lakota testimony in the latter half of the 19th century found the tradition already established, already structured, and already old enough that the elders who spoke of it regarded its origins as beyond the reach of individual memory. What the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 established was a formal American commitment to leave the hills alone. The Lakota had held them across generations that preceded any American document, and the treaty's value to them was its acknowledgement of that fact. The Great Sioux Reservation created by the treaty set aside the Black Hills as unceded territory belonging exclusively to the Sioux Nation, with no American citizens permitted to enter or settle within the boundary without Lakota consent. The treaty included the condition that any future modification of its terms required the approval of 3/4 of the adult male population of the Sioux Nation. Custer's expedition entered the Black Hills in the summer of 1874 with 1,200 soldiers, 2 geologists, a botanist, a photographer, and a reporter from the New York Tribune. The official purpose was reconnaissance. The practical purpose was to determine whether gold deposits mentioned in earlier accounts were substantial enough to justify the political cost of acquiring territory the federal government had formally agreed not to acquire. Winchell spent 6 weeks examining the rock formations, from the ancient granite core at the center of the hills to the sedimentary rings surrounding it, and he documented signs of cave formation in the limestone layers that the expedition did not have the equipment to explore below the surface. The expedition's framing as a scientific survey was an administrative choice with practical consequences. By describing the column's entry into treaty land as scientific reconnaissance rather than military incursion, the Army could argue that the expedition fell outside the specific prohibitions of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Whether a 1,200-man military column with artillery constituted a civilian violation of those prohibitions was a legal question that no one in the Army's chain of command was motivated to have answered. The geological reports and botanical collections produced during the 6 weeks in the hills served a function beyond their scientific content. They produced the appearance of systematic inquiry. The gold samples forwarded from the expedition reached assayers before the column had returned to Fort Lincoln. By the spring of 1875, miners were crossing the treaty boundary in numbers. The Army was not strongly motivated to stop. By 1876, an estimated 15,000 prospectors had entered the Black Hills. When the federal government made a formal attempt that summer to purchase the hills from the Lakota, and the Lakota declined to sell, the negotiations ended without further pursuit of legal alternatives. The Great Sioux War of 1876 settled in military terms what the treaty had decided in legal ones. After the battles of that year, including the engagement on the Little Bighorn, where Custer's immediate command was destroyed, Congress passed the Act of 1877. The Black Hills were removed from the Great Sioux Reservation without the Lakota people's consent and without the 3/4 approval required by the treaty for any modification of its terms. Congress took them through legislative act, without compensating the Lakota people and without the consent the treaty required, and the congressional record of how that was done is not obscure. It is plainly documented. What was taken was not only land in the sense that an extractive institution understood land. The severance of Lakota access to Pahasapa interrupted knowledge transmission systems that had operated within those hills for generations. The vision quests, the seasonal ceremonies, the oral traditions transmitted at specific sites, the relationship between the emergence account at Washu and the communities that had maintained it, all of these depended on the ability to enter the hills and use them in the ways they had always been used. Remove the access and the knowledge dependent on location-specific transmission begins to lose the conditions that made its continuation possible. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, operating through the latter decades of the 19th century and into the 20th, administered the residential boarding school system that removed Lakota children from their communities and placed them in institutions where indigenous languages and ceremonies were prohibited. The children who passed through those schools were the same generation that would have received the oral traditions their communities had maintained across centuries. The boarding school system operated on the explicit principle that the knowledge systems of indigenous communities needed to be replaced rather than preserved, and the Black Hills traditions were among the knowledge systems affected by that program. James Walker, a physician who worked on the Pine Ridge Reservation beginning in 1896, collected Lakota oral testimony over many years and produced detailed accounts of the knowledge systems connected to the Black Hills. His manuscripts entered the archives of the Colorado History Museum. They preserved accounts of the hills and the ceremonial traditions organized around specific sites within them, including the emergence traditions connected to Washu Nia, in forms that have been available to researchers for more than a century. Those accounts have not been substantially absorbed into the dominant public account of the Black Hills history. The records Walker assembled described the Black Hills as a landscape with distinct underground qualities. Multiple elders he interviewed spoke of the breath at Washu Nia as evidence of a world below that continued much further than any visitor to the surface could confirm. They described passages extending beyond the reach of anyone who had attempted to follow them, and formations that distinguished the cave from ordinary rock in ways they attributed to its role as an emergence site. Walker's manuscripts are ethnographic records rather than geological documents, but the physical properties they describe align with what 20th century geological survey confirmed in the same cave: airflow from connected passages extending far beyond the explored sections, chambers of unusual size, and formations unlike those found anywhere else on the planet. The correspondence between the two bodies of evidence was not examined by any institution that held access to both. The karst topography Winchell noted in 1874 extends across a substantial portion of the Black Hills limestone rings. Karst landscapes are defined by the dissolution of soluble rock by water over geological time, a process that produces sinkholes, springs, caves, and underground drainage systems across areas that can cover considerable distances. The limestone in the Black Hills capable of producing cave formation extends well beyond the boundaries of Wind Cave National Park, and cave entrances identified in the surrounding region suggest that the drainage system below the hills connects locations that the current survey maps treat as separate. In the summer of 1881, a rancher named Jesse Bingham reported that wind from a small opening in the limestone had blown his hat from his head. He returned with his brother Tom. They entered what they could reach by torchlight and described chambers of considerable size. Within the decade, a young man named Alvin MacDonald began descending into the cave system with ropes and lanterns, mapping passages the Binghams had not reached, and recording his findings in a journal he kept across multiple seasons in the early 1890s. MacDonald's journal survives. It describes rooms large enough that his lantern light could not reach the far walls, formations unlike any he had seen described in available accounts of cave exploration, and passages that continued beyond the reach of his equipment. He estimated the cave system was larger than anything documented in the region. In 1893, he died of typhoid fever at the age of 20. His journal remained, and the passages he had been mapping continued past the last line he had written. The geological surveys conducted at the cave in the years following MacDonald's work confirmed the system's unusual character. The boxwork formations covering its walls, thin fins of calcite projecting outward from the rock surface in honeycomb patterns formed by mineral-rich water moving through ancient fractures in the limestone, were identified as the most extensive examples of this geological structure found anywhere on Earth. The air pressure differential at the entrance was measured and documented by survey teams who were recording cave ventilation rather than looking for evidence of prior knowledge. The cave breathed. The instruments confirmed it. The Lakota had named the property the instruments confirmed. In 1903, Wind Cave was designated a national park under federal administration. The name came from the wind. The Lakota name, Washu Nia, was acknowledged in ethnographic literature and set aside in administrative practice. The oral tradition that had described the cave's existence and significance for generations before any settler approached its entrance was classified, within the developing framework of academic anthropology at the turn of the 20th century, as indigenous religion rather than as evidence of prior knowledge. The distinction had consequences. Religion could be acknowledged as cultural material. Prior knowledge would have required the institutional record to engage with the Lakota account as a source rather than as context. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879, conducted systematic documentation of indigenous North American cultures throughout the following decades. Ceremonial objects, oral testimonies, and physical items connected to Lakota traditions were collected, catalogued, and transported to institutional storage. Objects that had been in active ceremonial use, some of them connected to traditions maintained at specific sites within the Black Hills, entered institutional collections during the same decades in which those sites were being removed from Lakota control. What had been maintained became archived. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The mechanism by which the Black Hills passed from Dakota Territory to federal administration is documented in considerable institutional detail. The 1868 treaty exists in the National Archives. The congressional record from 1877, including the floor debates and committee reports, exists and has been examined by legal historians. The decision to take the hills without the required three-quarters consent was understood at the time as legally questionable by at least some of the legislators who voted for it. The argument that prevailed was not that the treaty had been violated by the Lakota, but that the practical realities of American settlement had rendered the treaty's terms unenforceable. The legal framework was adjusted to accommodate a decision that had already been made on other grounds. Black Elk, an Oglala Lakota medicine man, described the Black Hills in testimony recorded by the writer John Neihardt in the 1920s and published in 1932. Black Elk's account of the hills is specific about their ceremonial role and their position within the knowledge system that organized Lakota life. He describes them as the place where the relationship between the living world and the world that preceded it was most accessible, where certain forms of understanding could be sought that were not available elsewhere. What he described was a practical account of how specific places gave access to specific forms of knowledge. The Black Hills were central to that account, and they remained central to it whether or not any institution acknowledged that they were. The classification of Lakota oral accounts as religious material, rather than as an empirical record, had institutional consequences that extended beyond academic journals. When a cave system is designated a national park, the management decisions that govern how it is administered, how it is accessed, and what research is conducted within it are shaped by the institutional understanding of what the site is. If Wind Cave was understood primarily as a geological formation of unusual character, its administration would prioritize geological and biological survey. If it was understood as a site of emergence and ongoing ceremonial significance to a living community, its administration would have included consultation with that community as a matter of course. The 1903 designation chose the first framework. The Lakota account of what Washu was did not shape how it was administered. The financial beneficiaries of the Black Hills acquisition are not difficult to identify. Mining companies operating in the hills in the 1880s and 1890s extracted gold from the region's ore-bearing formations at a scale that made the area one of the most productive gold mining districts in the country. The Homestake mine, established near Lead, South Dakota in 1876, would operate continuously until 2002. Producing more than 40 million ounces of gold across more than a century of operation. The mine was established on ground that was, by the terms of the 1868 treaty, still Dakota Territory at the time of its founding. It operated without formal consultation with the Lakota people, on land whose legal transfer had not been completed by any process consistent with the treaty's terms. Across the full century of its operation, what the Homestake mine extracted over its century of operation was only one category of what the geological surveys had documented beneath the hills. Winchell's 1874 report had noted the limestone cave formations, the mica schist outcroppings, the varied mineral composition that distinguished the Black Hills from a simple gold deposit. A landscape this geologically varied produces an underground record that mining operations do not exhaust. The cave systems in the limestone rings of the hills accumulated across time spans that dwarf the period of any mining operation, and what they preserved in their formations and passages was laid down by processes that had nothing to do with the gold seams the Homestake mine was following. The extraction that took place above the cave systems did not address what lay within them. The granite at the core of the Black Hills is among the oldest surface rock in the central United States, more than 2 billion years old by geological measure, formed long before the sedimentary rings that surround it, and long before the limestone formations that hold the cave systems closer to the surface. The hills are, in geological terms, a place where the deepest layers of the continent's history are exposed at the surface. The Lakota emergence tradition describes a passage from a world below into the world above, and the hills are precisely the geological feature where the layered character of the Earth's history is most legible to anyone standing on the surface above it. The geological record does not confirm any particular account of what that passage looked like. It confirms that what lies beneath the surface of the Black Hills is older and more complex than what lies above it. The Oglala Sioux tribe, whose reservation at Pine Ridge lies south of the Black Hills, has maintained ceremonial relationships to specific sites within and adjacent to the hills across the entire period of their displacement from the hills themselves. Those relationships were maintained through internal transmission that the boarding school program attempted to interrupt and did not fully succeed in interrupting. The traditions connected to Washu did not end with the 1903 designation. They continued, in Lakota communities, alongside the cave's administration as a federal resource, without those two streams of knowledge ever being formally placed beside each other by any institution responsible for either one. The geological surveys of the Black Hills conducted through the 20th century continued adding to the picture of what lies beneath the surface. Wind Cave alone, as mapping progressed across the century, was found to contain more than 140 miles of surveyed passages, placing it among the longest documented cave systems in the world. Survey teams working in the cave during the mid-century period estimated that the mapped passages represented only a fraction of the system's actual extent. The airflow generating the pressure differential at the entrance was found to originate in a volume of connected passages far larger than the surveyed sections could account for. Cavers working in the system in the later decades of the century described arriving at passage terminations that felt, by every physical indicator available, like boundaries rather than endings. Between 1877 and the Supreme Court ruling in 1980, the Lakota pursued the Black Hills claim through legal and political channels across more than a century. They submitted claims to the Indian Claims Commission when it was established in 1946. They appeared before federal courts and submitted documentation to congressional committees. They litigated and relitigated the argument that the 1877 Act had violated the Fort Laramie Treaty and that the hills had therefore never been legally transferred. When the Supreme Court finally agreed with that argument, its ruling in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians acknowledged what the congressional record had suggested at the time of the taking. The hills had been taken without consent, in violation of the treaty under which they were held. The court awarded a monetary settlement of $105 million, plus interest accrued across the preceding century. The Sioux Nation refused it. Lakota leadership declined to accept the money on the grounds that the Black Hills were not for sale, had never been for sale, and could not be addressed through a financial settlement. The fund established by the court's award has remained unclaimed since 1980, accruing interest without interruption. The total value of the unclaimed fund passed $1 billion in the early 21st century and has continued to grow. What was taken from Paha Sapa was not property in the sense that American property law defines property. It was a relationship between a people and a place that their oldest surviving bodies of knowledge were organized around, and a financial settlement addressed only one of those two categories. The Black Hills claim is a claim about the relationship between a specific body of people and the specific body of land, that their ceremonies, their oral traditions, their understanding of the world's origin, and their sense of ongoing obligations are organized around. A real estate framework is built to address a different question, and the Lakota refusal to accept the court's award reflects an understanding of exactly that distinction. The refusal runs against every institutional assumption that governs how territorial disputes are resolved within American law, where a financial award is understood to close the matter. The Lakota refusal to accept that endpoint has held for more than 4 decades. What stands today on a granite ridge within the Black Hills that the Lakota called the Six Grandfathers are the carved faces of 4 American presidents, cut into the rock between 1927 and 1941. The ridge was renamed Mount Rushmore after Charles E. Rushmore, a New York attorney who had visited the region once on a mining legal matter. The Lakota name referred to the 6 directions of Lakota cosmological understanding, a reference that contained specific knowledge about how the ridge was oriented within the ceremonial geography of the hills. The carving was conducted over 14 years on a site that had specific significance within the Lakota relationship to Pahasapa, and no institutional record of the project's authorization includes any consultation with Lakota representatives about that significance. Archaeologists who have worked within the Black Hills in the later decades of the 20th century and into the 21st have documented evidence of human occupation extending back more than 10,000 years. The hills served as a resource zone, a ceremonial center, and a geographical reference point for peoples whose cultural traditions preceded the Lakota by thousands of years. What the cave systems below those surface sites might contain in terms of stratified cultural material, whether any portion of the cave environments was used in ways that left a recoverable record, has not been comprehensively examined. The management framework governing the cave system does not include systematic investigation of what might be found in the passages that no survey team has yet reached. The Lakota claim to the Black Hills is not a historical matter in the sense of something resolved and filed. Lakota leaders and legal representatives continue to advance the position that the 1877 Act was invalid, that the Supreme Court's monetary settlement does not address the Lakota relationship to the hills, and that the appropriate resolution would involve the return of federal land within the hills to Lakota management. Proposals along these lines have been advanced through congressional channels multiple times in recent decades. None has passed. The land remains under federal and state administration. The claim remains open. The full extent of the cave system below the Black Hills has implications that the survey literature addresses in geological terms, and that the Lakota oral tradition addresses in different ones. A cave system of more than 140 mapped miles within a limestone formation that surveys describe as extending well beyond what has been entered represents a physical record that precedes any human presence in the region by hundreds of millions of years. The Lakota tradition connects that underground world to the origin of the present age. Geological survey connects it to Mississippian period limestone laid down by an interior sea between 320 and 328 million years ago. Neither account is a complete description of what the cave system is. Both are addressing, from different frameworks, a landscape of extraordinary scale and age that lies beneath the same hills. Every geological map of the Black Hills produced since Winchell's survey of 1874 shows a more detailed picture than the one before it, and every expansion of that picture has confirmed that the hills contain more than any previous survey was able to reach. The cave continues past the mapped portions into territory that the available instruments have not followed. That pattern of progressive confirmation across successive surveys is consistent with a landscape that holds more than any single generation of surveyors has been in a position to describe. The geological formations within the hills carry names assigned during and after the survey period of the 1870s. In many cases, those formations had Lakota names already, names that described both their physical character and their relationship to the knowledge systems organized around them. The survey names replaced the Lakota names in the institutional record, and the institutional record became the one that appeared on maps, in scientific publications, and in the administrative documents that govern the management of the land. The older names did not disappear from Lakota community knowledge. They disappeared from the map. Wind Cave today administers more than 140 miles of surveyed passages within a cave system that experienced cavers and geologists describe as likely extending further than the current surveys have reached. The air pressure differential at the entrance still moves through the opening with the force the Lakota name described. The boxwork formations along the walls remain the most extensive example of their geological type found anywhere on the planet. The question of how large the cave actually is has not been answered. The survey teams who work there regularly describe the sense that what has been mapped is a boundary condition rather than a complete picture of what lies below. The Black Hills are visible from the surrounding plains at a considerable distance. The dark tree cover that gives them their Lakota name, the characteristic that made them identifiable to travelers crossing the grasslands for longer than any document records, is still there. Below the trees, the geological structure Winchell documented in 1874 is still there. Below the geological structure, the cave systems his report noted and could not descend are still there. What lies at the furthest extent of those systems, in the passages no survey team has yet reached, remains where it has always been. The hills hold what they have always held. The knowledge of what that is was carried by people who were removed from the land that knowledge was organized around, subjected to institutions designed to interrupt the transmission of what they knew, and offered a financial settlement to close a claim whose nature no financial settlement could address. They refused the settlement. The cave continues to breathe through the opening the Lakota named. The knowledge that named it, and the people who held that knowledge, are still here. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.